Hello and welcome to the ongoing budget coverage on Indian Express Online. A cautious stock market, a not so excited corporate sector, an unenthused urban Aam Aadmi, but a happy farmer. To give you an in-depth analysis of Arun Jaitley's proposals today, I have our in-house panel of editors, Harish, Shaji and Vedi with me. Harish, to you first. Clearly a pro-farmer budget with the focus on the rural sector, infrastructure, electrification and credit lines to the farmers. It seems like NDA government's attempt at an image makeover. They probably don't want to be labelled as Sood Boot Ki Sarkar, even as we all agree that the rural economy does need that kind of boost.
See, the political thing is very clear, the political motivation is there, but I think probably it makes economic sense also. Like as Jaitley said from the beginning, that the two engines of growth which are not picking up are private investment and export, and you have to look inwards. So probably it makes sense to invest in rural roads and this thing, and probably the multiplier effect of that would be much faster, and it makes sense. And hopefully, if you have a normal monsoon also, maybe the things may turn around, and so probably you are probably trying to see a recovery from below, rather than trying to depend on exports and all these things. So overall, I think it's a combination of good economics and good politics.
And good politics. Shaji, one good takeaway that everybody has unanimously agreed on is that the Finance Minister has stuck to the fiscal deficit target, 3.9% for this fiscal, 3.5% for the new one. How much of a room does it leave for the RBI governor to relax monetary policy rates, because that is an expectation that is now doing the rounds?
Well, I think he had actually in some ways committed actually before this, when the last policy review time to wait for the budget, in fact, actually, and see if there's a room for cuts actually. So probably after the latest consolidation roadmap in the present budget, actually, he probably will maybe nudge to cut rates, but modestly. But I personally think not going to help at all, because we've seen that last year the level of rate cuts which we had, 125 basis points,
only half of those got passed.
Much of it actually banks didn't pass it on actually. So I don't see much of a difference even this time, even if there is a moderate or a modest rate cut this time. That's not going to help. And actually historically, if you looked at it, interest rates probably to that extent actually having like what we saw the last time a decade ago when we had a similar slowdown, and actually interest rates were cut much more sharply. We just don't have the room to cut it so sharply this time. So the government is at a disadvantage on that count as of now. And besides that, that's one thing. And the other thing is on fiscal consolidation. This is the time when probably the government they had no option but to do consolidation, because oil prices are at record low. So at this time, if you don't do fiscal consolidation, when will you do consolidation? So that might cheer many investors, a lot of economists, many of those people overseas actually. That was a big worry in the markets, in fact. But we'll have to see how it plays out ultimately. Because even some of the measures which they've taken, which they've announced, in fact, when it translates into output, it will probably take 18 months to 2 years. That may be a little low. That may test the patience of many people and investors. That's the challenge for the government, I think.
Right. Vedi, now the government has continued with its thrust on infrastructure, a big chunk of the budgetary allocation going there. However, that said, there is this talk of big reforms which is missing this time around. So do you think those big ticket reforms like GST, etc., may not get the kind of push one was hoping for?
See, essentially, if you just look at the markets, how they have reacted, after yo-yoing, they ended 150 points down. So if I can just quickly crystallize it, even when it is 150 points down, it is the FIIs, the foreign institutional investors, who have sold about 2,000 crores today. So why is the foreign investor not really happy with the budget? So that's a question to answer. So the fact that he has stuck to the fiscal discipline, to fiscal prudence, that is the message which has gone out loud, not been bought by the foreign investor. So what has he done for the economy to really take off? So we have had 1.5, 2 years of 7.5 or that kind of growth rate. So would we go to the 10% mark with this budget? It doesn't look like. So he has stayed course. He's put out a non-event in the budget. he could have done something dramatic. There were no bold ideas, so to say, in the budget. Say, for instance, even on banking reforms. What he done? He has done a 25,000 crore booster shot, 1 year shot for recapitalization, which he says he will increase. Whether he has fiscal space to increase that or not is a secondary issue. But this bank recapitalization is not a solution for banking reforms. That is one small cog in that big wheel to push banking sector. Has he done something that calls for big consolidation among banks? We are having 28, 29 public sector banks, most of them saddled with huge NPAs. Are we doing something dramatic for resolving the NPA crisis? Not really.
Just barely touched on those two topics.
Touched on that. Neither has he said that Indradhanush, which the government has done, are like baby steps in banking reforms. He hasn't really taken bold moves on banking. That apart, even on say disinvestment strategic stake sale, which the previous NDA government did with some bit of controversies, of course, he hasn't really looked at disinvestment. Actually, the disinvestment target for the next financial year is 5,000 crore less than what he has budgeted for this year. So given the track record of this government in achieving disinvestment or stake sales, there is nothing which gives me an idea that there will be something more than even current year, so to say, in the next year. So the low-hanging fruits of reforms, of pushing through certain areas where he could have done without, say, much legislative, processes, he hasn't really touched upon. So I think that is one area to say that the budget is not really bold in ideas or in action.
All right. Shahji, the corporates were not very enthused with this budget. How do you think they're going to read into this one?
I wonder when the corporates are going to be enthused really in this country with many of the budget, because they're probably, as somebody says, the takeaways, the giveaways which they want, probably the list is pretty long. Maybe the expectation of a lower corporate tax rate, that hasn't come. It's a little bit of a puzzle why it hasn't happened actually, because it should have been accompanied along with removal of some exemptions in fact. So that hasn't happened, and the tax structure, for instance, actually it's become a little more complex actually, particularly after the government has been saying consistently that it would be a stable, predictive regime, but that's not happened, because the taxation of dividends is only one part of it actually, and then you had the cess, the number of cess, everything. So that's a terrible way of having a tax system cluttered. It's sort of a cluttered system instead of making it easier actually. So that's going to be a big disappointment. Plus other sectoral things which you see in budgets, some of the past budgets have actually addressed these when there's a slowdown a decade ago when they had sectoral packages actually. I don't think they looked at sectoral packages particularly when you had industries like steel and other things which are deep in trouble. So they haven't looked at those sectoral packages. So to that extent, there will be plenty of disappointment for corporates. And the fact that even interest rate cuts actually, even if they come, are going to be very modest actually. But the one interesting thing which probably I should have mentioned earlier, to me in this entire budget this time was the connect between the government and the RBI. That's the
I think
RBI
was very
governor
clear. They seem to have coordinated on this.
To me, actually, contrary to all the noise and the signaling outside, the RBI and the government seem to be working at probably on a single path, because if you look at it, the fiscal consolidation thing has been completely something which Governor Rajan has been talking of all along, and people were very skeptical about the government actually going down the path, and this is something which has been interesting to me.
Right. So Harish, to sum up, would you say this is a budget for Bharat? Because if we look at it, break it down, it still sticks to the fundamentals of keeping the economic growth on track.
Yeah, because I think the crisis has been much deeper for Bharat than for industry, right? I mean, industry has more staying power, whereas farmers are in a bad shape. And so it always makes sense to look at things from below, and so which is why I repeat, I think this is a good budget both politically and economically overall. So I don't know whether sentiment is going to improve of corporates, and I don't think that would have anyway changed. So I think this should give good returns. I think Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana and even Narega and this thing. I think it's not a bad approach. I would say that it makes sense.
All right. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today and sharing those inputs. So not a very bold budget, a budget for Bharat, but not bad for India at all. Thanks much for joining us today, but stay tuned to indianexpress.com/videos for more coverage.